another research article and study that was put forth by Mayberry and Lack was in 2003. So you can see that this research is almost a decade old. But this study had 3 different groups of deaf folks. We have a group of deaf second language learners, okay, a group of hearing second language learners, and then a group of deaf late first language learners, and I'll explain each of those. But let's talk about the first 2 groups first, the first 2 groups of second language learners. So you have a group of deaf kids who have deaf parents who learned ASL as their native language, at home, effortlessly acquired, okay? Then they go to school, about 5 to 7, they're exposed to English in school, and they, when you tested their English syntax, they showed no differences between their peers, their hearing peers, okay? Then the second group of second language learners, they're hearing kids who have parents that don't speak English. And so they're at home with their parents are speaking their native tongue, which in this study was Urdu, Italian, German, and French, okay? They go to school at about 5 to 7 years old, get exposed to English, and they show no difference in their English syntax to their peers. They have their first language, their native language, intact, and then they go to school and are exposed to English, and they have no detriments in their English syntax, okay? But if we compare these 2 groups to the third group, we can see how the delay in sign language exposure, specifically ASL, the delay in this exposure, you can see the effect of it. These kids go to school about 5 to 7, but they don't have a language. Their parents don't know sign, and they talk to them, but the input that they get is very limited. And so they come to school and they don't have sign or speech English. They don't have either one. And so they're exposed to it and are being formally taught around 5 to 7, the same time that the other 2 groups went to school. And you can see, I hope you can see the slide, that they have low performance on all levels of syntactic structure. So it's not just about exposure, it's about when the exposure takes place. Now, this premise that having a fully intact first language, native language, that is, this idea of having a fully intact first language, natively, naturally occurring, effortlessly acquired language, will lead to a second language. That idea comes from something that Cummins put forth called the linguistic interdependence theory. This was in 1989. And Cummins talked about that if you have full competence in a native first language, then just by being in a second language, being in a minority language, going into that because you have to deal with people every day who use the majority language, that transfer is going to happen. You're going to take what you know about your linguistic cortex and you're going to apply that to your second language. And so this is called the interdependence theory. And let's talk about Spanish just for a second. Spanish bilingualism it's the same idea, the same premise. And in schools where the language of instruction is Spanish, the teachers aren't just simply using the child's native language to teach Spanish skills. It's so much more than that. They're building all kinds of cognitive tools where the child is able to manipulate linguistic data. In other words, what the child hears, they learn how to manipulate that, how to rearrange it, and then how to apply that to math and how to apply that to science and social studies, which the textbooks happen to be written in English. But they already have that ability in their first language to be able to talk about it. And so their first language then transfers over to the second language, which is English. For the deaf child, this go out into the majority language, and because you're in it, you're going to be exposed to it, doesn't take place. There's linguistic, auditory input that is not fully accessible, right? The kids can't hear. And so this transfer of take your first language and it automatically transfers to your second language doesn't exactly apply here because they don't have exactly the same linguistic environment. But if a deaf child is given the ability to develop ASL skills and develop that linguistic cortex and develop that first and have that foundation first, then it transfers over to the second language, which is the majority language of English in the United States. Now, let's talk about specifically how ASL skills can be related to English literacy skills. And in this study, Goldwyn, Meadow, and Mayberry in 2001 talk about reading skills. And their research found that when a child has ASL and also MCE, so some kind of manually coded English, when the skills in those two areas increase, so does their English reading skill. Okay? However, the deaf kids that are only exposed to an MCE system or a manually coded English system, the kids who are only exposed to that and have some increase in complexity in that system, that does not transfer over to increased reading skills. And so it's the kids that have the ASL and the manually coded English that also seem to have increased English skills in their reading. Okay? So it's not just exposure to sign language, it's exposure to ASL that is really important here. In 2002, Preisler talked about that old theory that if you teach a deaf child to sign, it hinders their speech. Well, Preisler, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, debunked this theory with his research because he showed that sign language skills, when they increase and become more complex, in turn, their speech skills increase. And so it's actually the opposite of what we've all heard, that if you teach a deaf child to sign, they won't talk. It'll impede their speech. So this absolutely runs counter to that. He said that his research showed that increased signing skills led to increased spoken language skills. So it was positively correlated. In Sweden, we talked about last week that in order for your child to be a candidate for a cochlear implant, you first have to show that you have given that child a sign language linguistic environment for 1 year prior to ever becoming a candidate. And so Sweden seems to understand what's going on and that the exposure to sign is very, very important for a child. And so the proponents of cochlear implants often will tell parents, make sure you're only speaking and don't introduce sign. This totally debunks that. Preisler's research showed that the more sign language skill the child has, the better their speech was. And the better their speech was, the better their sign language skills were. And so they seem to be going hand in hand. And it was in Sweden, it was talking about the Swedish Sign Language. They weren't talking about ASL. Another body of research comes from Travenel and Villanueva, I think that's how it's pronounced, talked about the ability to decode written English, and that ASL literate signers were better able to decode the written text. And so if the child had ASL, the complexities of the wholly intact linguistic picture, the native language, then that transferred over and they were able to decode and break down linguistically the English text that they were trying to read. Of course, this has academic implications, right? Their ability to decode actually increased over time, so the more, as time goes on, their ASL skills are becoming more complex, right, morphologically, because that's what happens in normal language development. In addition to that, their ability to decode English also became more complex as time went on. But you'll notice the last point on the slide says that the manually coded English signers, they didn't have the same ability to decode English. Their decoding skills did not increase with time. So even though they were able to sign English better, it didn't transfer over into being able to digest what was in a written text. They determined that it seems that the mixed systems of the two, the English grammar and the sign grammar or the ASL grammar, that when you mix these two together, it impairs this ability to decode written English. So rather than help it, which remember that was the point of total communication, right? The point of education of oralism was so that kids would be literate and be able to speak in English, because that meant you were educated and they were able to read and write in English. But the MCE system seemed to have the actual opposite effect and just confuse the systems. So I mentioned that it's not just about exposure to sign language. It's about when the exposure takes place, right? And I built this argument that it needs to be before they're 6 years old, right? It has to be before they get to school. But when they do get to school, we have a catch-22. Because what has been found is that it's hard to find qualified teachers who are fluent in ASL. Remember when we talked about oralism and how at the beginning of oralism, deaf teachers were fired and ASL went underground. And it was used in secretive places among deaf people, and it was not shared with hearing people. It was kept to themselves in the deaf community, and it was protected. Well, total communication came on the scene, right? And sign was allowed back into the classroom, but that wasn't ASL, because the hearing teachers didn't know ASL. They weren't exposed to it, right? It was hidden from them. And remember, that was in the 1970s, right? And so 70s until now, this new body of research about bilingualism and the idea of ESL, that's 40 years' time, where we have 40 years and generations of deaf children going through this system of the mixing up of the English and the sign. So 40 years. And so 40 years later, programs are saying, we agree, bilingualism seems to be the way to go. We need ASL teachers, but we can't find them. And then there's also the catch-22 of the teacher education programs. So when people want to become teachers for the deaf, and they go to a deaf ed program, Sherry Cook next door just talked about that, about what she learned in her 2 sign language classes. And so I'll talk a little bit about deaf ed programs at the very end. But I want to talk more about programs in the United States right now that say they're bye-bye, okay? In 2003, there was a survey that went out across the country asking programs that serve deaf and hard of hearing kids, what is your philosophy? What is your language philosophy in your school? And 78 residential schools replied. So they filled out the survey and they sent it back in to Lesotho and Lawless. 19 of these 78 schools said, we are bye-bye schools. Okay, we are bilingual, bicultural. That's our language philosophy here. 19 of the 78. And of all the deaf and hard of hearing students at that time, about 36 to 40% were enrolled at one of these 19 schools. Okay? Now, the shock comes in the next point when I tell you that 37% of these bilingual, bicultural schools were still using MCE as their language to model English to their deaf kids. Okay? And 47% of that 19, okay, so about 10 of them, 9 or 10 of them, roughly half, said that only about half of our teachers are fluent in ASL. And 79% of those 19 schools had no formal curriculum, no formal bye-bye curriculum. And so they wanted to be bye-bye, but there was no formal curriculum of bilingualism in place in their school. and half of their instructors were not fluent in ASL. Kind of shocking, right? In 2009, the American Annals for the Deaf did another survey on bye-bye in our schools in the U.S. At this time, 582 programs responded, and of those 582, 196 said we are bye-bye schools. Okay? But only 19 of those, only 19 of the 196 used ASL as their mode of communication. That means 177 of these bye-bye programs don't use ASL. They use some other means, auditory, oral, TC, cued speech in some schools. Shocking, right? Okay, so we have this idea and we have this philosophy, much like the philosophy of TC, right? We have this philosophy of bye-bye and the desire to be that and not getting there quite yet. And so this leads to a cycle that we have in deaf education where a philosophy is put forth and enacted in our schools without the research to back it up that says this is a good philosophy, we should do this. The research isn't there before the philosophy is implemented. But you really can't get the research until the philosophy is implemented. And so we have this new idea, this new model of deaf education called bye-bye, bilingual biculturalism. And it's a new philosophy, right? But the jury is out. Is it going to be effective? Are deaf kids who are educated this way going to be more academically successful? We think so, but the jury's out because the research is in its infancy. It's really time to revisit all of this. As you know, I finished my thesis. This was all done as part of my thesis. I finished that in 2009. And the most current article that I used in my entire research bibliography was 2009. And so they did their research prior to that, right? If they were published in 2009, they actually conducted their experiment maybe 10 years prior to 2009. So 1999 maybe. And so these issues really need to be redone. I could write a whole other thesis gathering data and information and the research that has been done in the last 20 years on what is happening in these bye-bye schools now. What is happening? Are we really being successful in this new philosophy or not? The hope is that we are. But again, we need deaf teachers who are fluent in ASL, or teachers in general who are fluent in ASL, because that's the key to making this happen. We have a poster, I think it's next door maybe, about the greatest irony here. You can go and do a Google search on the internet and look for sign language for babies and find a plethora of sites. Is it over there? A plethora of sites targeting hearing parents who want to teach their hearing babies how to sign. Lots of projects being targeted towards hearing parents that just want to be able to communicate sooner to their baby. Because remember I told you that signing babies babble first? So communication, there's a lot of frustration when you have a baby, when you're trying to figure out what do you want. And so deaf babies babble sooner. They can tell you they don't want any more. They can tell you they want their milk before they can say milk. And so there are many, many sites that target hearing parents of hearing babies and sell products to them, and there are hearing babies learning ASL because of this. The greatest irony is that when a parent who is hearing has a deaf child, they aren't offered this plethora of information about how to teach your baby how to sign. They're often given information about cochlear implants. It's not my desire today to bash cochlear implants, but often that's what happens, and that takes you down that route of English and oral and not the opportunity to have that fully intact naturally occurring, effortlessly acquired native language that is ASL in the U.S. We need greater awareness of the research that shows that when you give a deaf baby ASL first, they'll be more successful with spoken English and written English. We need to get that word out. We need to tell the deaf. We need to tell professionals in the medical field because they don't know. If they knew, maybe they would offer more options. We need to get the word out, and we need more money for more research. We need more people to do their theses on these issues, and we need to tell people what the research says. We need more research, really. I'm going to leave you with one video. The Deaf Bilingual Coalition does a really good job of advocating for deaf children and their right to ASL. This is their website. And let's see. There we go. I have to hold it. If you can see their mission statement, it says the Deaf Bilingual Coalition promotes the basic human right of all deaf babies and children to have access to language and cognitive development through American Sign Language. So they are all about getting the word out. And if you go to resources and you come down here to light reading, you get all the research that they have put on their website. And it's the research that I'm talking about and others. So more research supporting the idea of a fully intact ASL for your deaf baby first. Do that first. Let them acquire what's natural first. And then add the English to it. It will be much more successful. I'll show you what it can look like. I'm not sure why this is over in the later. This is a preschool classroom, and these are two little deaf girls, two little preschoolers. I'm guessing they're probably about 4 years old, and they're having a conversation about marriage. It is the cutest thing ever. And of course, they're using ASL. They're 4, they're in preschool, they're talking to each other about who they're going to marry. And I want you to watch it. It is subtitled, it's captioned, because this little girl here, she mostly has her back to you, so you really can't see what she's signing. And then the other girl responds to what she said. So it is captioned to help you kind of follow what's going on, what's transforming. My point in showing you is this is what it can look like. This is normal language development that happens in a rich, naturally occurring ASL environment.